The Sign of the Beaver by Elizabeth George Spear. A Dell Yearling book. A Newberry Honor book. Reading level 5.7. Chapter 7. Before he had his eyes open next morning, Matt knew that something was wrong with this day. When it came back to him, he sat up with a groan. Etienne! What had possessed him to give a book to an Indian? How could he possibly teach a savage to read? He tried to think back to the time his mother had taught him his ABCs. He could plainly see that brown-covered primer she held in her hands. He had detested it. He had had to learn the short verses printed beside each letter. A. In Adam's fall we sinned all. That would hardly do. To be honest, he wasn't sure to this day just what it meant. He would feel mighty silly trying to explain it to a heathen. Then, happily, he recalled another book that had been sent to his sister, Sarah, from England, with a small picture to illustrate each letter. No nonsense about Adam. A was for apple. Sarah had been luckier than he. But he had no way of making pictures, and there were no apples here in the forest. What could he find for A that the Indian would understand? He looked about the cabin. T for table, though it was unlikely they'd ever get as far as T. How about A for arm? That was simple enough. B? His eye fell on the leg bone of the squirrel left from last night's meal. The stub of a candle would do for C. D? Door would be just the word for Etienne. He certainly could walk out of one fast enough, and would again, no doubt, long before they got to D. He doubted that Etienne would come. Still, he had better be ready. He stirred the fire, ate a chunk of the cold Indian corn cake, and set about to prepare a schoolroom. He shoved the two stools together and laid Robinson Crusoe on the table. He did not have paper or ink. He found a ribbon of birch bark in a corner and tore off a strip and sharpened a stick to a point. Then he waited. Etienne came swinging a dead rabbit by the ears. He slung it disdainfully on the table. "Thank you," Matt said. "That's a big one. I won't need anything else for several days." His politeness brought no response. "Sit here," he ordered. He hesitated. "I never thought as how I'd have to teach anyone to read, but I have figured a way to start." Silently the boy sat down, as straight and rigid as a cedar post. When Matt hunched himself onto the other stool, the boy's scowl deepened. Plainly he did not like having the white boy so close to him. Etienne had no need to be finicky, Matt thought. He smelled none too sweet himself. The grease smeared on his body, even on his hair, stunk up the whole cabin. It was supposed to keep off the mosquitoes, he'd heard, but he thought he'd rather have the pesky insects himself. He drew a letter on the birch bark. "This is the first letter," he explained. A. A for arm." He repeated this several times, pointing to his own arm. Etienne kept to his stubborn, scornful silence. Matt set his jaw. He could be stubborn too, he decided. He opened Robinson Crusoe. "We'll pick out the A's on this page," he said, trying to control his impatience. He pointed. "Now you show me one." Etienne stared straight ahead of him in silence. Then, to Matt's astonishment, he grudgingly laid a grubby finger on the letter A. "Good," said Matt, copying the word Sockness used so often. "Find another." Suddenly the boy broke his silence. "White man's book foolish," he scoffed. "Right, arm, 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 all over paper." Puzzled at first, Matt saw his own mistake. "Hundreds of other words begin with A," he explained, "or have A in them, and there are 25 more letters." Etienne scowled. "How long?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" "How long Etienne learn signs in book?" "It will take some time," Matt said. "There are a lot of long words in this book." "One moon?" "1 month? Of course not. It might take a year." With one swift jerk of his arm, Etienne knocked the book from the table. Before Matt could speak, he was out of the cabin and gone. "Reckon that's the end of the lessons," Matt said to himself. Cheerfully he began to skin the rabbit. Chapter 8. By the next morning he was half sorry the boy would not be coming again. He didn't know whether he was annoyed or relieved when Etienne walked through the door without a sign of greeting and sat down at the table. Matt decided to skip beef or bone. In the night he had thought of a better way. "This book isn't a treaty," he began. "It's a story. It's about a man who gets shipwrecked on a desert island. I'll read some of it out loud to show you." He opened Robinson Crusoe at the first page and began to read. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York. He stopped. He remembered suddenly how the first time he had tried to read this book he had found that first page so dull he had come close to giving up right there. He'd better skip the beginning and get on with the story if he wanted to catch Etienne's attention. I'll read the part about the storm at sea, he said. He had read the book so many times that he knew exactly where to find the right page. Taking a deep breath, as though he were struggling in the water himself, he chose the page where Robinson Crusoe was dashed from the lifeboat and swallowed up in the sea. Nothing can describe the confusion of thought which I felt when I sunk into the water, for though I swam very well, yet I could not deliver myself from the waves so as to draw breath, for I saw the sea come after me as high as a great hill, and as furious as an enemy. Matt looked up from the page. There was not a flicker of interest in the boy's face. Had he understood a single word? Discouraged, he laid down the book. What did a storm at sea mean to a savage who had lived all his life in the forest? Well, he said lamely, it gets better as you go along. Once more Etienne took him by surprise. White men get out of water? He asked. Oh, yes, Matt said, delighted. Everyone else on the ship is drowned. He gets thrown up all alone on an island. The Indian nodded. He seemed satisfied. Shall I read more of it? Etienne nodded again. Go now, he said. Come back, Seba. The next morning there was no question of beef or bone. Matt had the book open and waiting at the part he wanted to read. This is about the morning after the storm, he explained. Robinson Crusoe looks out and sees that part of the ship hasn't sunk yet. He swims out and manages to save some things and carry them to shore. He began to read. Once again, it was impossible to tell whether Etienne understood. Presently, Matt slowed down. It was discouraging reading to a wooden post. But Etienne spoke at once. White man not smart like Indian, he said scornfully. Indian not need thing from ship. Indian make all thing he need. Disappointed and cross, Matt put the book down. They might as well get on with the alphabet. He drew a B on the birch bark. After Etienne had gone, Matt kept thinking about Robinson Crusoe and all the useful things he had managed to salvage from that ship. He had found a carpenter's chest, for instance, bag of nails, 2 barrels of bullets, and a dozen hatchets. A dozen! Why, Matt and his father had come up here to Maine with 1 axe and an adze. They had cut down trees and built this whole cabin and the table and the stools without a single nail. Crusoe had found a hammock to sleep in instead of prickly hemlock boughs. He could see now how it must have sounded to Etienne. Come to think of it, Robinson Crusoe had lived like a king on that desert island. Chapter 9. A few mornings later, at the end of the lesson, Matt delayed Etienne. How did you kill that rabbit? He asked, pointing to the offering Etienne had thrown on the table. There's no bullet hole in it. Indian not use bullet for rabbit, Etienne answered scornfully. Then how? There's no hole at all. For a moment it seemed that Etienne would not bother to answer. Then the Indian shrugged. Etienne show, he said. Come. Matt was dumbfounded. It was the first sign the Indian had given of what exactly? He had not sounded friendly, but there was not time to puzzle this out right now. Etienne was walking across the clearing, and he apparently expected Matt to follow. Pleased and curious, Matt hobbled after him, grateful that he no longer needed the crutch. At the edge of the clearing, the Indian stopped and searched the ground. Presently he stooped down under a black spruce tree, poked into the dirt, and jerked up a long, snake-like root. He drew from the leather pouch at his belt a curious sort of blade. The blade curved into a hook. With one sure stroke, he split one end of the root, then peeled off the bark by pulling at it with his teeth. He separated the whole length into 2 strands, which he spliced together by rolling them against his bare thigh. Next he searched about in the bushes till he found 2 forked saplings about 3 feet apart. He trimmed the twigs from these, drawing his knife toward his chest, as Matt had been taught not to do. Then he cut a stout branch and rested it lightly across the forks of his saplings. From the thread-like root he made a noose and suspended it from the stick so that it hung just above the ground. He worked without speaking, and it seemed to Matt that all this took him no time at all. Rabbit run into trap, he said finally. Pull stick into bush so white boy can kill. Golly, said Matt, filled with admiration. I hadn't thought of making a snare. I didn't know you could make one without string or wire." "Make more," Etienne ordered, pointing into the woods. "Not too close." After Etienne had gone, Matt managed to make 2 more snares. They were clumsy things, and he was not too proud of them. Splitting a slippery root, he discovered, was not so easy as it had looked. He spoiled a number of them before he mastered the trick of splicing them together. They did not slide as easily as the one Etienne had made, but they seemed strong enough. Next morning he showed his traps to Etienne. He had hoped for some sign of approval, but all he got was a grunt and a shrug. He knew that to Etienne his work must look childish. However, on the 3rd day one of his own snares had been upset, though the animal had got away. The day after that, to his joy, there was actually a partridge struggling to free itself in the bushes where the stick had caught. This time the grunt with which Etienne rewarded him sounded very much like his grandfather's "good." Silently the Indian watched as Matt reset the snare. Then they walked back to the cabin, Matt swinging his catch as nonchalantly as he had seen Etienne do. "You don't need to bring me any more food," he boasted. "I'll catch my own meat from now on." Nevertheless, Etienne continued to bring him some offering every morning. Not always fresh meat. He seemed to know exactly when Matt had finished the last scrap of rabbit or duck. Sometimes he brought a slab of corn cake or a pouch full of nuts, once a small cake of maple sugar. Plainly he felt bound to keep the terms of his grandfather's treaty. Matt stuck to his part of the bargain as well, though the lessons were an ordeal for them both. Matt knew well enough what a poor teacher he was. Sometimes it seemed that Etienne was learning in spite of him. Once the Indian had resigned himself to mastering 26 letters, he took them in a gulp, scorning the childish candle and door and table that Matt had devised. Soon he was spelling out simple words. The real trouble was that Etienne was contemptuous, that the whole matter of white man's words seemed to him nonsense. Impatiently they hurried through the lessons to get on with Robinson Crusoe. Matt suspected that the only reason Etienne agreed to come back day after day was that he wanted to hear more of that story. Skipping over the pages that sounded like sermons, Matt chose the sections he liked best himself. Now we came to the rescue of the man Friday. Etienne sat quietly, and Matt almost forgot him in his own enjoyment of his favorite scene. There was the mysterious footprint on the sand, the canoes drawn up on the lonely beach, and the strange, wild-looking men with 2 captives. One of the captives they mercilessly slaughtered. The fire was set blazing for a cannibal feast. Then the second captive made a desperate escape, running straight to where Crusoe stood watching. 2 savages pursued him with horrid yells. Matt glanced up from the book and saw that Etienne's eyes were gleaming. He hurried on. No need to skip here. Crusoe struck a mighty blow at the first cannibal, knocking him senseless. Then, seeing that the other was fitting an arrow into his bow, he shot and killed him. Matt read on. The poor savage who fled but had stopped, though he saw both his enemies had fallen, yet was so frightened with the noise and fire of my piece that he stood stock still, and neither came forward nor went backward. I hallooed to him and made signs to him to come forward, which he easily understood, and came a little way, then stopped again. He stood trembling as if he had been taken prisoner and just been to be killed, as his 2 enemies were. I beckoned to him again to come to me, and gave him all signs of encouragement that I could think of, and he came nearer and nearer, kneeling down every 10 or 12 steps in token of acknowledgment for saving his life. I smiled at him and looked pleasantly, and beckoned to him to come still nearer. At length he came close to me, and then he kneeled down again, kissed the ground, and taking my foot set it upon his head. This, it seemed, was a token of swearing to be my slave forever. Etienne sprang to his feet, a thundercloud wiping out all pleasure from his face. "Nada!" he shouted. "Not so!" Matt stopped, bewildered. "Him never do that." "Never do what?" "Never kneel down to white man." But Crusoe had saved his life. "Not kneel down," Etienne repeated fiercely. "Not to be slave. Better die." Matt opened his mouth to protest, but Etienne gave him no chance. In 3 steps he was out of the cabin. Now he'll never come back, Matt thought. He sat slowly turning over the pages. He had never questioned that story. Like Robinson Crusoe, he had thought it natural and right that the wild men should be the white man's slave. Was there perhaps another possibility? The thought was new and troubling.